All right, shall we?
Yep, that's
All
good.
right, let's go ahead and start our evening. I am Ruth Hopkins, and I am serve as the chairperson of our Church and Society Committee at Asbury Church in Prairie Village, Kansas. I hope you're all coming to join us this evening. A little bit about our schedule. I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then Charlene, our able staff, is going to tell you how you can throw in your questions and answers. And at the very end, then Lee will conclude and tell you about some upcoming events. So I am going to read the introduction. Our speaker tonight is Rebecca Best, Wave. She is originally from North Carolina. She is an associate professor of political science at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Her research addresses questions of women's roles in armed groups and the reintegration of female veterans, as well as peace processes in civil conflict and the efficacy of terrorist designation and proscription regimes, including the U.S. State Department's Foreign Terror Organization list. She lives in Prairie Village with her husband, her son, 2 cats, and 1 dog, and she attends Asbury. Charlene, you want to do a quick explanation of Q&A?
Absolutely. So for those of you who might be new to this format, this is a webinar format, which means you can hear and see us, but we can't hear and see you. So the way that you interact with us is through the chat function, which is going to be at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and it'll look like a word bubble. You can type in there and chat with all of us. And we'll also be having a little Q&A time after Rebecca's done speaking. So you can type in some questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll get to that. And you can type those in any time. So if she touches on a point, then you'd like to make a note of that, go ahead and send a question, and then we'll touch all of the questions whenever she's done talking. So with that, I'll hand this off to Rebecca. And thanks for being here, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlene and Ruth, for inviting me and coordinating all this stuff, and to all of you for showing up. So I'm going to start with a reminder that is as much to me as to anyone. When I typically talk about radicalization, I am talking about radical action, radical violence. That is radicalization to violence, because when I talk about it, I'm usually teaching courses on political violence and terrorism. But it's important to keep in mind that most people who are radicalized, the way that we typically think about it, they never use violence. They're radicalized to extremist ideologies, but they don't quite make that leap to actually using violence. And I think both of those things are interesting, because if we are seeing people radicalized to these extremist ideologies, and we are, obviously, if we think about, for example, the riot on January 6th, right? Most of those people were not terrorists, right? Most of those people were not there to use violence, or did not use violence while they were there. Some did, and there is a distinction there between those two. So again, I typically talk about radicalization to the point of violence, but I think both these things, radicalization to extremist ideologies, not up to the point of actually engaging in violence, and radicalization to the point of violence, are scary to recognize in our communities, in our families. So they're both significant, right? The difference between radical thought and radical actions, though, is the difference between, for example, justifying terrorism and actually engaging in terrorism, or providing material support for terrorism or for violence. And again, I say terrorism, but this could include, for example, hate crimes that we don't always think of as being the same thing. So what causes people to become radicalized? We know that things like experiencing some significant loss, that is, losing your home, losing your career, a loved one, your way of life, can make an individual more vulnerable to radicalization, but it doesn't differentiate people who become radicalized from those who don't. Not everybody who becomes radicalized has experienced this. Not everybody who experiences these types of losses becomes radicalized. It's also important, though, to realize that things like pathologies, right? There's a temptation often to think that people who engage in extremist violence in particular have some sort of pathology. That doesn't seem to actually predict terrorist violence or radical types of violence. So it's not pathologies. It's not poverty. We often think about that as being an explanation for terrorism. It's not ignorance. You know, we like to think, we like to imagine that if we could just educate everybody, that we'd see less support for radical ideologies and radical violence. But the research tells us that's not it either. These are common scapegoats, but they don't actually predict radicalization. And I'll mention, again, I just noted that sort of caveat about how I typically think of radicalization. And you can see here from this definition from Chenoweth and Moore's book, The Politics of Terrorism, that they are specifically also to thinking of it in those terms. It can be useful, though, as we think about radicalization, to talk about psychological or sort of behavioral explanations. And again, pathologies don't predict who is going to engage in these types of violence. But instead, when I say it's useful to think about sort of psychological approaches, it's useful to think about personality traits that might be associated with the decision to actually engage in violence. Understanding individual behavior, right? Behavioral approaches. Why, when faced with the same circumstances, some people choose to engage in violence while others do not. With regard to terrorism, we know there's no unique psychology of terrorism. There's no single profile of a terrorist. Terrorists have different motives for engaging in the violence that they use. Individuals often have multiple motives. For example, some people may join or be radicalized to a group both because they care sufficiently about the cause and want to risk their lives to further that cause, and because the group is able to offer them something that they're not getting elsewhere in their lives, right? If they care deeply and they feel like they're able to make a difference, that offers some fulfillment, but maybe it's also offering something else in terms of community, right? That can be a powerful motivator. I mentioned that education is not the silver bullet that we often imagine it to be. And to show you what I mean by that, these data are a little bit old. This is opinion data from 2004. And this is people in Morocco. They were asked, this was Pew Global, polled by Pew Global. The question was, well, I've paraphrased a little bit, but the question boiled down to, are suicide attacks against Americans and other Westerners in Iraq justifiable? And what you can see here, these are the percentages who said, yes, they're justifiable. University educated people, far more likely. Now notice, of course, the scale, right? It's not 0 to 100. We are looking at pretty high figures in general, but much higher, you would say. So again, noticing the scale, this does not mean twice as high, but we're still looking at a noticeable difference here between those with university education versus those with any other level, from no formal education to secondary education. Overall support in Morocco in 2004 for this question was at 66%. Now, I want to mention by 2005 that had declined to 56%. So these things are not necessarily stable over time. But that's pretty consistent, right? We often do see that higher levels of education is associated with greater willingness to view violence for a political cause as being justifiable. If we look to Palestine, and I don't recall the year of this poll, I apologize, 40% of those polled, and this would have been probably around the same time frame, 40% of those with higher education responded to a poll saying that they supported dialogue with Israel. 60% of those with only 9 years of education said that they supported dialogue. So if you think about that, that's a 20% drop in support, or sorry, a 1/3 drop from 60% to 40% when we look at 9 years of education versus having higher education support for dialogue. Using 2002 data from the Pew Global Attitudes Project, Christine Fair and Brian Shepard find that women, young people, computer users, those who believe that Islam is under threat, those who want religious leaders to play a larger role in politics, are more likely to support suicide bombing and other attacks against civilians. And that's using not just data from Morocco, but from a variety of predominantly Muslim countries. Again, these are 2002 data, so this is at a point where our top concern with radicalization is jihadist radicalization. So again, they find, that the very, young people, women, computer users, which again suggests something about both potentially income and education. They also find that the very poor are less, not more likely to support such attacks. So all of this sort of tends to go against typical ideas that we have about who supports the use of violence. Now, justifying terrorism or violence is not the same thing as committing terrorism, right? Again, this is that distinction between radicalization of thought and radicalization of action. So all of this is about radicalization of thought, right? It doesn't mean that these people are going to actually go out and carry out a suicide bomb. The vast majority of them, right, are not going to do that. That's a very different thing to say it's justifiable. But when we look at data from the Islamic State, now the fun thing about the Islamic State is that they've actually been keeping pretty good records for some time, even going back to before the group was the Islamic State, back when it was al-Qaida in Iraq. They kept pretty decent HR records. And the evidence suggests that they do this because they want to try to optimize the people that they get, right? They do intake interviews with people joining the group to find out what their skills are, what their experiences are, and then deploy them in the best possible role so that they're not leaving any skills on the table. The fun thing about that, though, is that sometimes those HR documents get leaked. So we have some leaked documents from back when the group was al-Qaida in Iraq. And we've also got some documents that were leaked around 2016, were leaked to NBC and then corroborated by researchers at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. Basically, the Combating Terrorism Center had these data, but they had been classified and all they could do is sort of provide some sort of summary of them until NBC came to the Combating Terrorism Center and said, hey, would you guys like these data that were just leaked to us? And they said, actually, yes, we would, because we've been trying to publish on this. We've been trying to put this out there and it's all classified on our end. So that's how they corroborated them. So early 2016, they get these data that cover 4,600 different foreign militants, foreign meaning not from Syria, who traveled to Syria between 2013 and 2014 to join the Islamic State. These documents reveal, and you can find all this stuff online. I think probably a Google search of West Point CTC Islamic State, and then something about human resources would probably pull it up for you. Dodwell is the name of the first researcher on it, if anyone's interested in looking at these data, because they're fascinating. But when we look at these documents or what's available to us of them, the reports that the CTC has put out, they reveal that the average Islamic State recruit, not within Syria, right, but traveling to Syria to join between 2013 and 14 is, quote, relatively well educated when compared to the educational levels in their home countries. what that boils down to is about a third of these Islamic State recruits on whom education data was collected, and it's missing on a few people, but about a third of them for whom we have data reported having some college education. About 50% reported a high school degree as their highest level of education. So we can say about 80% have high school or more as their level of education that they're reporting. So these are not people who are generally uneducated, right? That's not what's causing it. When we look at their knowledge of Sharia by comparison, it's a sort of different story. 70% reported their knowledge of Sharia as being basic, which is the lowest level that it was possible to record. Only 5% reported their knowledge of Sharia to be, or Islamic law to be advanced. So that's kind of interesting. They're generally well educated, but their religious education is by their own accounting not very good. All right, so what makes people susceptible to believing in extremist ideologies, to falling for conspiracy theories, all the stuff? So again, education alone, increasing people's education alone is not enough to solve the problem of extremism, or it turns out of conspiracy theories and susceptibility to conspiracy theories. It's not even clear that it actually helps, which is, you know, on the one hand, unfortunate. On the other hand, we should probably be, you know, doing education for its own sake, and for other reasons anyway. But it wasn't enough with regard to al-Qaida or the Islamic State, and it isn't enough with regard to white supremacy and QAnon either. Belief, though, is not indiscriminate. It's not that people who fall prey to conspiracy theories are so incredibly naive that they'll believe anything, right? It's more that they are susceptible to rumors that support pre-existing beliefs, and we all are. It's how we're wired. We tend to engage in motivated reasoning, and we tend to be susceptible to confirmation bias. So motivated reasoning, we want to find a way to sort of conclude that the things that we already sort of believe or want to be true are in fact true. And our confirmation bias, right, we're sort of more likely to accept data that confirm our prior beliefs, and we tend to resist information that challenges our beliefs or our group identities. And we all do that. This is true across the board. If you pay attention to yourself, whatever your personal sort of political leanings are, you may notice that you are a little bit inclined to really want to believe certain stories that you hear that cast the other side as being bad, right? You know, and sometimes those are true and sometimes they're not, but it's important to sort of be aware when we have that part of our brain that's like, ooh, you know, where we respond emotionally. Because we are more likely to believe conspiracies that we want to believe, that we want to have be true. If I already mistrust or dislike a group, whether that's people of a certain race, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or political party, I am more likely to believe rumors that cast them in a bad light. And that reinforce my prior belief that they are bad, right? It simultaneously makes me feel sort of justified that I was right, they are bad, you know? And I'm more likely to dismiss any evidence to the contrary, any evidence that suggests that maybe I got it wrong. And that, of course, is part of what makes deprogramming people once they have fallen prey to this a lot harder, is that we do have that tendency to sort of engage in motivated reasoning and sort of explain away any evidence to the contrary of our views and look much less critically at stuff that supports what we believe. So this means both that people who are predisposed toward racism, for example, are more likely to believe conspiracy theories about the inferiority of other races and the threat that those races present to their own, but also that, for example, Democrats are more likely to dismiss actions from, for example, the Trump administration that they'd have perhaps applauded from a Clinton or Biden administration, and that Trump supporters are more likely to believe that, for example, former President Obama was not born in the United States. And level of education does not change this. In fact, in studies, knowledge and political knowledge and education are often supported, or often associated rather, with greater susceptibility to conspiracy theories. Whether that is because people who have greater prior knowledge are better able to sort of engage in motivated reasoning, that is to sort of reason their way into reconfirming their prior views by accepting this information, or because they're more likely to have prior beliefs that they have than this impulse to defend, even inside their own heads, right? Or because they are aware of prior actual conspiracies. Because again, not all conspiracies are fake. Conspiracy doesn't mean that it's fake or made up. It just means that we're talking about, a sort of conspiracy where there's like a group of people conspiring together to do something, whether that's real or fake, whether it's really happening or not. So for example, people with greater knowledge might be aware, for example, of the Tuskegee study on syphilis in Black men, where the government intentionally and without consent or informing people let syphilis go untreated well past the point where penicillin was an accepted treatment. The CIA secretly testing the use of LSD on unsuspecting members of the population without consent. The Watergate break-in, all these sort of, conspiracies that actually did happen, that there is evidence for, if they're aware of these, right, that erodes trust in institutions, in experts, in the government, and makes you potentially more susceptible to believing conspiracy theories that are not real. So those are some things that, that sort of tend to be associated with this. I mentioned the sort of the birther conspiracy earlier. Surveys from 2012, using survey evidence from 2012, researchers have found that, for example, Republicans who express both racial resentment and when asked questions, evidence higher political knowledge, were actually more likely than other groups, including Republicans who had lower levels of political knowledge, to believe the birther conspiracy. So again, knowledge is not the silver bullet here alone. It can't do it by itself. So what else? Extremism and conspiracy theories can tend to appeal sometimes to those who have a degree of narcissism. That is, a sense that they have a better understanding than others of what's going on. And so, that sort of conspiracy theories can sort of reinforce that sense that, I know the real truth here. I'll talk about narcissism as a predictor as well of violent behavior in a moment, but those who have a desire to belong to a larger group can be more susceptible to these ideologies that might offer them acceptance. If you think, for example, about the QAnon slogan, where we go one, we go all, that sort of gives you an idea of that is part of what people are sometimes looking for in these groups. A desire to feel like you're in the know, again, going back to that, the appeal to narcissists, people who sort of want to feel that they are in the know. It can offer people a sense of order or security. To people faced with trauma, disruption, or loss, as I referenced at the very beginning, conspiracy theories and extremist views can offer a villain to blame for your problems and a solution to regain security, right? Here's who caused this, here's whose fault it is, and here's what you have to do to make things right again. They can, again, also offer that sense of community or camaraderie. They are also, people who are more susceptible to these tend to be people who have more extreme political views already. So regardless of which end of the political continuum you might say that you're on, if you're out at the extremes, you are generally going to be more susceptible to these conspiracy theories. And also intellectual certainty. So conspiracy theories and susceptibility or belief in conspiracy theories is associated with sort of lazier thinking patterns. That is, you're not questioning as much. I probably shouldn't say lazier thinking patterns, but using sort of cognitive shortcuts, right? So again, we're not talking about people's level of education. We're not even really talking about their level of intelligence. We're talking about whether or not they sort of take shortcuts in their thinking, or whether they are questioning and asking questions, and sort of how confident do they feel that they really understand things. All of that can affect susceptibility. But what about moving from radical thought to radical action or violence? Again, narcissism is sort of generally a sort of critical trait here, in that, and I don't want to, these are all generalities, right? So I shouldn't say critical in the sense that it has to necessarily be there, but generally we think narcissism is relevant here because violent radical action is typically costly, right? And so in order to engage in it, you have to believe that your actions are critical to your cause. You also have to believe that your cause is larger than yourself. So for that, altruism, right? And that's kind of weird because we're not accustomed to thinking of people who engage in extremist violence, hate crimes, or terrorism as being altruistic. But if we think about what their values are, how they understand the world, how they understand who their in-group or their community is, right? I'm not talking about altruism in the sense that they want to do good for the world at large, right? But to do good for what they perceive as their community instead. So those who engage in terrorist violence or similar types of violence often view their actions as helping an in-group that is their community. This is why, while some Islamic State recruitment videos have aimed to excite young men who want to engage in violence and they want to make it look like it's a video game and highlight the violence, many others of these recruitment videos and recruitment tactics have aimed instead to convince susceptible women and men that the Islamic State is building a utopian caliphate in which Muslims can live in peace and harmony, free from Western interference and discrimination. What they are selling is an idea that in the West, or even in countries that are viewed to be dominated by the West, that if you are Muslim, you are treated differently, you are discriminated against, and it will never be otherwise. And so, for example, right, if we think about the attack some years ago on Charlie Hebdo, for example, right, and what is the purpose of this attack, right? Was the purpose to sort of terrify cartoonists from making cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, or was it to gin up anti-Islamophobic violence, anti-Muslim violence, to sort of sell that point further, that if you are Muslim and you are living in a Western country, that you'll never be accepted? And I think it was probably more the latter, right? To sort of sell that narrative. And that is what they are selling, is the only way that you get to equality, the only way that you get to this good outcome is by coming to us. Now, setting aside, right, never mind that the Islamic State has killed many, many Muslims, right? That's not in the recruitment video. That's not what they're selling, but that goes to that sense of altruism. And it also, I think that example also goes to the fear of the out-group, right? So again, the idea that perhaps part of the motive for the Charlie Hebdo attack was less retaliation for a comic and more about the reaction that the Charlie Hebdo attack was going to provoke against Muslims living in France, right? And that then contributes to this fear of an out group. Talking about, issues, so when we bring it back home, right, when we talk about issues or groups as security threats, that justifies actions and responses that wouldn't normally be allowable or conscionable. When you have trusted people within what you conceive of as your in-group, who start talking about a security threat from some out-group, whether that's illegal immigrants, whether that's Muslims, whether that's Asian Americans, whether that's Black people, right? Start talking about the security threat that those people pose to your group, that becomes justification for action by the state. So what we see, for example, is that in democracies, we typically expect to see more respect for human rights in democracies. But research suggests that that's only the case when the public generally views the violence or human rights abuses as being targeted against other citizens. If you see it as being targeted against an out group, right, whether that's people in another country, whether that's non-citizens, that tends to get higher levels of support than we might like to think. So whether it's by a state or whether it's by militias, communal groups, individuals, if it can be cast as a security threat, that makes that action more acceptable. And the security threat, or the threat generally, can be sort of a threat to physical security. It can be declining status of your own group relative to another. It can be sort of, vengeance that the other group might want against your group for some historical crime or action. A sense that that aspects of identity are changing, etc. So a lot of ways that we can view that. I'm going to move on though, because I see I'm taking a little bit longer than I had meant to at this point. So how do you respond if you see radicalization in your community, in your family? What do you do? Responses like, "You're a racist, you're insane, you're an idiot," they're easy. They're really easy, and they feel so good for a moment, right? We feel like we have really, called out the other party, and we have stood up for whatever group they're attacking. But it's counterproductive. If we are telling people, you're racist, you're insane, you're an idiot, right? Those things are not going to help you to sort of find common ground with that person and make progress. Instead, what experts are suggesting is listen without shaming, right? We know that we now know that shame produces almost no positive benefits. Try to keep your own emotions out of it, because for the other person, this is a highly emotional topic. It's probably highly emotional for you too, right? I can say all of this really easily, but when confronted with someone who holds these views that I find abhorrent, I find it really hard to actually carry this stuff out. So this is not easy stuff to do. But for example, in talking about her own experiences in being de-radicalized from Westboro Baptist Church, Megan Phelps Roper, who's Fred Phelps's granddaughter, credits people she interacted with through, wait for it, Twitter and Words with Friends as being critical in getting her out of Westboro Baptist Church, which sounds crazy to us, right? Twitter de-radicalized someone, but this is what she says happened. And she says, that there were several individuals who interacted with her as if she was a person. It wasn't that they were always nice to her. It wasn't that they accepted her views at all. They didn't. They disagreed with her. But they would have conversations with her and about other things sometimes. In an interview with the New Yorker, one of those people, David Abitbol, said that his goal was to humanize Jews to her. He said, I wanted to be like really nice that she would have a hard time hating me. And he said one day that he had tweeted about the television show Gossip Girl, and Megan Phelps Roper responded sort of jokingly about one of the characters. And And he responded back, you know, for an evil something something, you sure do crack me up. And they had this sort of back and forth that would go on over time. And he and others on Twitter questioned her about her beliefs and started to gently prod her about inconsistencies in those. And that brings me to the next sort of piece of response. Look for common ground. A lot of people who fall into conspiracy theories see themselves as critical thinkers and skeptics. So use that. And they are being skeptics, right? They are skeptical of the common sources of authority. They are skeptical of official sources of authority, whether that's the government, whether it's scientists, whether it's experts, medical professionals, you know, teachers, whoever, right? They're skeptical of these traditional sources, but often they have responded by turning to less reliable sources and accepting those as truth. And so one of the next suggestions, right, then is to say, oh, you know, I'm also a critical thinker, and I want to know, you know, why do you think that this person is more trustworthy than that person, right? What might, for example, you know, Trump have to gain by spreading X theory? What might an anti-vax doctor have to gain from spreading doubt about conspiracies, right? And sort of looking at, you know, what are they getting? Are they getting something out of it? What are they getting? Whether that's a claim, whether it's fame or you know, some sort of monetary deal. Ask, don't tell, right? Don't tell them, you're an idiot. Obviously, this person is being, you know, paid off by this group, or they're just doing it for the attention, right? Ask them, why do you think blah, 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 you know, and sort of ask about any contradictory views. Sorry, I'm not ready for that one yet. Ask about any contradictions that you might find. In Phelps Roper's case, one of the things that she cites, both in interviews that she's given and public talks that she gives, that was critical for her. And it wasn't, again, I'll go to this one now, it wasn't immediate, right? But she says that it wasn't uncommon for critics of the church to throw back at them that Phelps Roper's mother, Shirley Phelps Roper, had her oldest son, she conceived her oldest son while she wasn't married, and then married a different person, right? And so they would say, well, doesn't this make you guys hypocritical? And the church would say, well, no, because Shirley repented, so it's different. But in this particular case, David Abitbol, actually, him again, asked her one time, you know, he said, well, I see you've got this sign that says, death penalty for gay people. I think it was actually a slur instead, but you get the idea. And he said, you know, if your mom is okay because she got to repent, and you say, well, we're going to apply the death penalty to other people who do things that are inconsistent with our views, aren't you denying them the opportunity to repent? And this was something that Megan actually thought about apparently for months, right? That she struggled with for months, and she'd ask her family about it and they'd sort of write it off. But it was this, you know, questioning of inconsistencies that seemed to matter. Going a little bit more with being patient, right? Being patient and gentle. It's hard not to get emotional when somebody is questioning your beliefs. And so if you're trying to talk to somebody about their, you know, conspiratorial views, you are questioning their beliefs that they might hold very tightly and that they have begun to see more as being part of their identity. We also know that the more sort of that people start to feel their views under attack, they can often cling to those more tightly. So you want to be very patient, very gentle, recognize that it's going to be a slow process. You're probably, you know, I probably shouldn't say you probably won't succeed in de-radicalizing somebody, but you know, if it were easy, we wouldn't be talking about it. All right. And then the final thing that I'll mention, and there's a lot of other resources that I'll put up in a minute on a separate slide that you can look to. Don't ignore race at home. So all of this is about how to respond once radicalization happens. But these are about how to prevent radicalization, as well as the last one is also responding, right? but don't ignore race at home. The world isn't colorblind. It doesn't treat everybody equally. So you have to explicitly talk about this with kids. And that's not true just of race. It's also true of a lot of other factors, right? The world does not treat people equally. But with race, right, if we don't talk about the effects of things like systemic racism, the way that race is sort of built into laws and how they are actually carried out, even where the word race is not specifically mentioned, right? We know there are often racist effects of laws. There's the history of racism in this country and what that's done to things like family wealth. If we don't talk about racial bias, including the implicit biases that many of us are not aware that we hold or are not aware that we act on, and the history of race in this country, we will be raising racist kids, right? I think everybody on here is probably aware that the sort of the you know, sort of we don't see color approach is not working. But when we don't talk about those things, we're inherently telling white kids that race isn't a problem, certainly not one they should be concerned with. And so when they see things like Black Lives Matter protests, right, they don't know why would that be necessary, right? When they see statistics on race and incarceration, and they see, you know, how much more likely Black people are than white people to be incarcerated, then they're going to look for another explanation besides racism. And they're also going to find answers on the internet that we don't like. And then, okay, the last thing I'll mention here is building relationships of trust in the community. Right now, again, we see really high levels of mistrust in all sorts of traditional sources of authority. This mistrust increases susceptibility to conspiracy theories, right? You're looking for some other expert, some other source of authority. Maybe expert's the wrong word, but some other source of authority. And it's also easier when we have those high levels of mistrust, when we see a story about the people that we've started to mistrust, whether that's, again, the people of the opposite political party, the media, the government, et cetera. It's easier to buy that story. All right. So, and then we start to then retreat into our in-groups that reinforce our views, and we find our new authority figures that might not be based on much. All right, I am going to just flip over to this last slide, which has some resources for anybody who's interested in looking into more on this. And this one is actually just the local Shawnee Mission Area Council, PTA. They're doing a diversity, equity, and inclusion book drive right now. And again, as I mentioned, talking about these issues with kids is super important. One of the things that the Southern Poverty Law Center recommends that people do if they want to reduce racism and conspiracy theories and things like that in their own communities is to make sure that their schools have diversity and equity materials available. So the book drive is at a great time. And yeah, these implicit biases tests, they've got them on all kinds of things. Like, do you have a bias against people of a certain weight, right? Do you have biases that are based on colorism or against Asian Americans? And you can take them, they're designed to actually see where you might have biases. So I think that's really useful because I think often we aren't aware of our own implicit biases. I'm going to stop though now and see if there are any questions.
There is one in our Q&A, and I just want to tell everybody again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and Rebecca will cover some of your questions. So I got one in the Q&A box from Barbara Lukert, and it says, is radicalization more or less common today than it was a century ago?
Great question. I don't know that we have great data on that. So on the one hand, if we do have great data on it, I'm not aware of it, but I don't think that we do. Certainly there is the potential to radicalize people through the internet now. There's been some research done on declining civic engagement among Americans in particular. I don't know how much research has been done around the world on declines in civic engagement, but if you're familiar with the book Bowling Alone, right, that's what that's about. The idea that we we're on the internet, we're in our homes. I always think, I don't know if this was Lee or Gayla, but I feel like one of you at one point did a sermon on how we don't, we often have our garages now where we don't have to go out, we don't have carports. I feel like I remember you talking about how we don't see our neighbors as much because of that. That would have been like 2 years ago. That was you? And yeah, so it is possible that because we're seeing that decline in civic engagement and the rise of the internet, that it might be a bigger issue, but I really don't know that we have the best data on it.
All right. Actually, 2 people would like to know how you first became interested in this area of scholarship.
I got interested in terrorism because I guess because I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened. And I grew up in a part of North Carolina that is right in between 3 large military bases. And so I just remember, that day looking around at my classmates and thinking, how many of them were going to end up fighting in the war that was probably coming at that point. And so then I guess after that, I was just really interested in terrorism.
There's one that's really interesting. I struggle with how differently the belief systems are between siblings. How does it happen, and how do you maintain loving relationships once you're all grown up?
I don't know. Yeah, that is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. And, it's really interesting right now as we see a lot more news coverage about these different belief systems within families and the radicalization, for example, of one sibling or of a parent, and the sort of the struggle to balance your own kind of mental deprogramming, but I don't know.
All right. Has research addressed the connection between feelings of disenfranchisement and radicalization? Yeah,
there's actually a lot of research on that. So there's some research, for example, on democracy and whether terrorism is more common. And again, I come at all of this with a terrorism research perspective, but whether, for example, terrorism is more commonly sourced from within democracies or not. The argument in favor of democracies is just access and ability, whereas the argument against is, but in a democracy, people may feel more enfranchised. And so there is research that goes beyond that and looks at, is there an excluded group? What do protections for minorities look like? And we do see that those things do matter. So yeah.
All right. Where and how do we make relational connections with people whose views are radically different from ours?
That's a great question. And I think that would be sort of one of those things where we do hear, like different things that you can try. So the obvious one is I'm thinking about the book Bowling Alone. If you can get into something like a bowling league, or sometimes church choirs are referenced, but of course, a lot of times you'll see fairly common, some greater uniformity there in terms of political views and certainly religious views. But any sort of civic engagement that you can, and when I say civic engagement, that includes things like voting or volunteering on political campaigns, but it also includes just getting out into your community and meeting other people, whether that's a supper club, whether it's a block party, whether it's a cultural festival. But to maybe more to Barbara's question, one of the things that the Southern Poverty Law Center recommends in their literature for communities is to actually start hosting those events. So one example that they give, which I really love, and I don't know if maybe Church and Society wants to put this together so that I can just free ride on that, but it's one of the things that they suggest is a supper club for people from different backgrounds where there are no speakers, there's no real sort of political bent to it, and the only rule is sit next to somebody you don't know. And so they recommend things like, for example, on anniversaries of significant dates in the community, that you commemorate those anniversaries, and hold multicultural festivals and things like that to try to facilitate these interactions.
Yeah, that's a cool idea.
Yeah, I love that.
One more question in the, or I got a couple actually. Sorry, let's see. If you encounter someone who is threatening political violence, who should you report this to?
So you should definitely report that. And the general advice is, even if you don't think it's serious, report it, and get it documented. And part of that is just because, for example, if they are serious, right, that can be investigated, even if it's just something like that you observe somebody harassing someone because of their race or ethnicity, that you want to get that documented so that when someone else faces that same problem, there will be a record that this has happened. I think it was Florida State recently had a professor resign who had been serially harassing Asian American women students, because he didn't think they'd report it. So definitely report it. You can report it to the local police. I think you can contact the local branch of the FBI as well. But and again, that would be something I would turn to a Southern Poverty Law Center if you have any questions about reporting or anything like that.
I have two questions that are pretty similar, but they're covering the same thing. So are there any warning signs, or is there any way to predict when a person or a group is about to cross the line to be violent?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. You definitely don't want to second guess yourself later if you didn't take action. If you think about, for example, Dylan Roof, the Charleston church shooter, he told his friends that he was going to do something. He told his friends that he had a gun, that he wanted to kill Black people. They did not report it. And so one of them was actually sentenced. I don't remember what the sentence was, but yeah, if you hear somebody talking about that, even, the temptation often is to think that they're not being serious, right? But if it comes up, if you know that they've acquired a weapon, there's not really I don't think there's any way to sort of be certain.
Anybody else have any questions? That's all I've got.
I don't see anybody. We've had a great group here tonight, though, haven't we?
Yeah.
Rebecca, you did a great job. I wrote down some of my own takeaways from you, and I learned a new term, cognitive shortcuts.
It sounds a lot better than lazy thinking.
It does. And when you said it that way, I thought, oh, I have to write that down.
I have to try really hard when I'm learning something new in math to not take cognitive shortcuts and then not learn it.
That was wonderful. But that was...
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me and for the great questions. I know some of them I could not adequately answer, and I apologize. But I definitely recommend checking out the resources that SPLC has available. NPR has been doing an excellent series recently on radicalization as well. So, and these tests, if you haven't, at least do one. They take about 10 minutes, and they're very revealing.
Well, the impact of radicalization happens in large and small ways in our lives, and in ways that we don't even know.
Yeah.
When it's happening to us.
Yeah. And it's really scary, I think, because we see friends or family saying things that we might once have thought unimaginable for them to say.
Yeah. I don't know. It's hard, but I appreciate your work and what you're doing.
Well, thank you.
And that you're here. So we're going to continue in our church and society with offering forums. And we have another one that we're going to offer on June the 10th, and that's a Thursday night. And that will be at 7 o'clock. And our speaker that night is going to be a man by the name of Tyrone Bates. And Tyrone is the coordinator for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Shawnee Mission School District. So we will be publicizing more about that and exactly what he will be talking about. But you can, if you put that on your calendar now, it's Thursday night, June 10th at 7 o'clock, right back here on Zoom, and we'll look forward to that.
I'm writing it on my calendar. Actually, I'm not writing it on my calendar. I'm writing it beside my calendar right now.
Good. So thanks again, Charlene. Thanks for coordinating all of this so that we can all get on here and be together. And thanks to you, Ruth, for the leadership that you give to the church and society as its chairperson. And Rebecca, I am looking forward to the day when I can look out into the congregation at Asbury and see the three of you in that back row.
We are as well. We are as well.
Yep, I'm looking forward to that, and it will be here one of these days, and it will be a great day, and we'll have something to celebrate.
Yes.
But again, everybody, thank you for joining us. And what do we say? God bless you all, and we'll see you soon and come back.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you, everybody.
Yep.
Bye.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.